Catherine Rose had always been different. Even as a baby, she stretched longer than other children her age. By the time she turned 5, she was already taller than kids who were 8 years old. Her mother would dress her in long skirts, hoping to hide her unusual height, but nothing could disguise the fact that Catherine was growing into something the small town of Millbrook had never seen before. The year was 1897, and in the rolling hills of Tennessee, people lived by strict rules about how women should look and act. A proper lady was supposed to be small, delicate, and quiet. She should be able to look up at her husband with admiring eyes. Catherine Rose, however, was none of these things. By her 12th birthday, she stood taller than most grown men in town. Her father, William, owned the local blacksmith shop. He was a kind man with calloused hands and a warm smile, but even he didn't know what to do with his unusual daughter. He watched other fathers walk proudly with their petite daughters on Sunday mornings, and his heart ached for Catherine. He could see the stares, hear the whispers, and feel the weight of every cruel comment that followed his child wherever she went. Catherine's mother tried everything she could think of. She bought special shoes that were completely flat, hoping they might make Catherine appear shorter. She sewed dresses with horizontal stripes, thinking they might create an illusion of width instead of height. She even took Catherine to 3 different doctors, asking if there was something wrong that could be fixed. Each doctor simply shook his head and said, "Some people are just built different. Nothing to be done about it." The children at school were ruthless. They called her Tree Girl and the Giant. During recess, they would ask her to reach things from high shelves, not because they needed help, but because they wanted to point and laugh. The older boys would dare each other to ask Catherine to dance at school events, treating it like some kind of joke. She learned to eat her lunch alone, sitting under the big oak tree behind the schoolhouse, where she could hide from the pointing fingers and snickering voices. As Catherine grew into her teenage years, the situation only got worse. At 16, she was 6 feet tall and still growing. Her mother had given up trying to make her appear shorter and instead focused on teaching her to be useful around the house. "If you can't be pretty," Mary would say with a sigh at least, "you can be helpful." Catherine learned to cook, clean, sew, and manage household accounts better than any other girl in town. But deep down, she wondered if being useful was enough. The church ladies were the worst. They would gather after Sunday service, speaking in hushed tones that weren't quite quiet enough. "Poor thing," they would say, "who's ever going to marry her? She's taller than Reverend Johnson, and he's not a small man." They spoke about Catherine like she was a problem that needed solving, a puzzle with no good answer. When Catherine turned 18, her parents decided it was time to find her a husband. This was what young women did in 1910. They got married, had children, and ran households. William used his connections in the blacksmith trade to arrange meetings with young men from neighboring towns. He hoped that somewhere out there was a man who wouldn't mind Catherine's height, or maybe even appreciate it. The first suitor was a farmer named James from the next county over. He was 22 years old and stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall. When he arrived at the Rose family home and Catherine answered the door, his face went white. He stammered through dinner, barely eating, and left before dessert was served. Later, he sent word through William's friend that Catherine was too intimidating for him. The second suitor lasted a bit longer. Robert was a shopkeeper who came, highly recommended by the local preacher. He was educated and polite and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Catherine. They talked about books they had read and places they dreamed of visiting. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to hope. But when Robert stood to leave that evening, the top of his head barely reached Catherine's shoulders. He never returned, and when William asked why, Robert simply said, "A man needs to feel like a man." One by one, potential husbands came and went. There was the banker who excused himself to use the outhouse and never came back. The teacher who spent the entire evening staring at Catherine's feet, as if trying to figure out how they could possibly be real. The traveling salesman who asked if Catherine had any shorter sisters he could meet instead. Each rejection cut deeper than the last. Catherine began to believe what everyone was saying about her. Maybe she really was too tall, too strange, too much for any man to handle. She started avoiding social gatherings altogether. When the annual harvest dance came around, she helped her mother prepare food but refused to attend. "What's the point?" she asked. "No one's going to ask me to dance anyway." By the time Catherine turned 23, the whole town had essentially given up on her prospects for marriage. The younger girls would sometimes ask their mothers, "What's going to happen to Miss Catherine?" And the mothers would shake their heads sadly and say, "Some people are just meant to be alone." Catherine threw herself into helping others instead of focusing on her own loneliness. She began teaching reading to children whose families couldn't afford proper schooling. She helped elderly neighbors with tasks that required someone tall and strong. She became known throughout Millbrook as the woman you called when you needed help reaching something high or lifting something heavy. But late at night, when the house was quiet and her parents were sleeping, Catherine would stand by her bedroom window and look out at the stars. She would wonder if somewhere in the world there was a place where being tall wasn't seen as a curse. She dreamed of a life where she could walk with her head held high instead of constantly trying to make herself smaller. The townspeople had created a story about Catherine that seemed impossible to change. In their minds, she was the spinster, the woman who would never marry, the cautionary tale they told their own daughters about being too different. They spoke about her with a mixture of pity and certainty, as if her fate was already written in stone. What none of them knew was that, far away in the mountains of North Carolina, there lived a man who had heard whispers about the tall woman of Millbrook. This man understood what it felt like to be different, to be stared at, to be judged before anyone took the time to know your heart. He had been thinking about Catherine for months, wondering if the stories about her were true, and more importantly, wondering if she might be the answer to his own loneliness. But Catherine knew nothing of this mountain man. All she knew was that another day had passed in Millbrook, another day of being too tall, too different, too much for the small world. She had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. High in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, where the morning mist clung to ancient trees like ghostly fingers, lived a man who understood loneliness better than most. His name was Thomas Walking Bear, and at 7 feet 4 inches tall, he was a giant among men. But his height wasn't the only thing that set him apart from the world below. Thomas was Cherokee. Born in 1885, when his people were still recovering from the wounds of forced removal decades earlier, his parents, Joseph and Morningstar, managed to avoid the Trail of Tears by hiding deep in the mountains, but the cost of survival had been steep. They lived in constant fear, never knowing if government officials might come looking for them. When Thomas was just 8 years old, tragedy struck. His parents died within days of each other from a fever that swept through their hidden valley. The boy was found by a white trapper named Old Pete, who took pity on the enormous child and raised him as his own. Pete taught Thomas how to hunt, fish, and most importantly, how to work with his hands. But he could never teach him how to fit into either world, the Cherokee community that barely knew him, or the white society that feared him by the time Thomas reached his 20s. He stood taller than any man in 3 counties. His hands were massive, capable of splitting logs that other men needed axes for. His shoulders were broad enough to carry burdens that would break a normal person's back. But despite his incredible strength, Thomas was gentle by nature. He spoke softly, moved carefully, and had a way with animals that seemed almost magical. Thomas had built himself a cabin deep in the woods, using nothing but his bare hands and simple tools. Every log was perfectly fitted, every joint was solid, and every corner was square. The cabin wasn't large, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. He had carved Cherokee symbols into the doorframe, symbols of protection, peace, and hope for the future. The few people who knew about Thomas called him the mountain ghost. Sometimes hikers would catch glimpses of him moving through the trees, and they would return to town with wild stories about a giant who lived in the wilderness. Most people thought these were just tall tales, but Thomas was very real. His preferred the company of deer, bears, and birds to humans who stared at him like he was some kind of monster. Thomas made his living as a carpenter and stonemason. Though he had to travel far from his mountain home to find work, when he did venture into towns, he always caused a stir. Children would hide behind their mothers. Grown men would step aside to let him pass. Everyone would whisper about the Indian giant long after he was gone. Despite the stares and whispers, Thomas was an incredible craftsman. He could build anything: houses, barns, bridges, furniture. His work was so good that people would overcome their fear just to hire him. But he always worked alone, ate his meals alone, returned to his mountain cabin alone at the end of each job. The loneliness was the hardest part. Thomas would sometimes sit on his porch in the evenings, looking out over the valley below, and wonder if he would spend his entire life without a companion. He had tried to court women before, but the results were always the same. They were either terrified of his size or put off by his Cherokee heritage. Most couldn't get past both. There had been Rebecca, the schoolteacher in Asheville, who seemed interested in his gentle nature until she stood next to him and realized how enormous he truly was. There was Helen, the merchant's daughter, who enjoyed their conversations until her father found out about Thomas's native blood and forbade her from seeing him again. And there was Lucy, the preacher's niece, who actually seemed to care for him until the church congregation made it clear that such a union would never be accepted. Each rejection taught Thomas that he was too different, too much for the world to handle. He began to believe that his size and heritage were curses that would keep him alone forever. He threw himself into his work, creating beautiful things with his hands, while his heart grew more isolated with each passing year. But Thomas had one companion who never judged him, an old Cherokee woman named Grandmother Willow, who lived even deeper in the mountains. She was one of the few people who remembered his parents and could tell him stories about his heritage. Grandmother Willow was tiny, barely reaching Thomas's chest, but she had a spirit that seemed as large as the mountains themselves. It was Grandmother Willow who first told Thomas about the tall woman in Tennessee. She had heard the story from a traveling trader who spoke of a woman in Millbrook who was so tall that no man would marry her. The trader had mentioned it as a joke, laughing about the beanpole spinster who tower over everyone in town. But Grandmother Willow wasn't laughing. She looked at Thomas with knowing eyes and said, "Sometimes the Great Spirit creates two people who are meant to find each other. Maybe this woman understands what it feels like to be different." Thomas couldn't stop thinking about this mysterious, tall woman. Night after night, he would lie in his bed and wonder what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, whether she felt as alone as he did. He began to imagine conversations with her, wondering if she might be the one person in the world who wouldn't be afraid of his size or judge him for his heritage. Months passed. Thomas found himself asking every traveling merchant, every wandering preacher, every person who passed through his area if they had heard more about the tall woman in Tennessee. Slowly, he began to piece together more details. Her name was Catherine Rose. She was kind and educated. She helped people in her community, despite how they treated her. She was indeed very tall, taller than most men. The more Thomas learned about Catherine, the more he felt drawn to her. Here was a woman who understood what it meant to be rejected for something beyond her control. Here was someone who knew the pain of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Here was possibly the only person who might look at Thomas and see a man instead of a monster. As winter gave way to spring in 1917, Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. He would travel to Tennessee to meet this Catherine Rose. He didn't know if she would accept him, but he knew he had to try. The loneliness had become too much to bear, and something deep in his heart told him that this woman might be his only chance at happiness. Thomas spent weeks preparing for the journey, crafted a small wooden box with intricate Cherokee carvings, hoping to give it to Catherine as a gift. He practiced what he would say to her, how he would introduce himself, without frightening her. He even visited Grandmother Willow one last time to ask for her blessing. "Go, my boy," the old woman said, placing her weathered hand on Thomas's massive arm. "Your heart knows what it needs. Trust the path that calls to you." And so, with hope and fear battling in his chest, Thomas, walking bare, began his journey down from the mountains toward Tennessee, toward a woman he had never met but felt he had been searching for his entire life. The morning Thomas Walking Bear arrived in Millbrook, Tennessee, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread quickly through the streets that a giant stranger was walking down Main Street, and by the time he reached the Rose family's blacksmith shop, curious faces were pressed against every window in sight. Thomas had never felt more nervous in his entire life. His massive hands were sweating, and his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times during his long journey from the mountains. But now that he was actually here, all those practiced words seemed to disappear from his mind. William Rose was hammering a horseshoe when he noticed the shadow that suddenly blocked the sunlight streaming through his shop doorway. He looked up and nearly dropped his hammer. Standing in the entrance was the tallest man William had ever seen, with kind, dark eyes and hands that could probably crush rocks. But what struck William most was how respectfully the giant held his hat and how gently he cleared his throat before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas said in his deep but soft voice. "My name is Thomas Walking Bear. I've traveled from North Carolina because I heard about your daughter, Catherine. I was hoping I might have permission to meet her with honorable intentions." Of course, William blinked several times, trying to process what he was hearing. In all the years of failed courtships and rejected suitors, no man had ever traveled so far just for the chance to meet Catherine. And certainly no man had ever asked permission with such genuine respect in his voice. "You came all this way just to meet my Catherine?" William asked, still not quite believing it. Thomas nodded seriously. "Yes, sir. I understand she's a woman of unusual height, and I thought perhaps we might have something in common. I know what it's like to be different." Before William could respond, Catherine herself appeared in the doorway that connected the shop to their house. She had heard voices and came to see who was visiting her father. When she stepped into view, something magical happened that neither Thomas nor Catherine would ever forget. For the first time in her 25 years, Catherine Rose had to look up to meet a man's eyes. And Thomas, for the first time in his 32 years, was looking at a woman who didn't seem tiny and fragile next to him. They stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, both of them realizing that they were seeing something they had never expected to find. "You're beautiful," Thomas whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Catherine felt her cheeks turn red, but not from embarrassment. No man had ever called her beautiful before. She had been called tall, strange, unusual, intimidating, but never beautiful. "You're very kind," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The news of the giant's arrival spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. By noon, half the town had found excuses to walk past the Rose house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the enormous man who had come to court their spinster. The other half gathered in groups, whispering and shaking their heads about what they saw as an impossible match. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was the first to voice what many were thinking. "It's like watching two circus freaks find each other," she said, to anyone who would listen. "What kind of children would they have? Giants. It's not natural." Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the grain mill, had his own opinion. "The Indian's probably just looking for a place to settle down. Thinks he can trick poor Catherine into supporting him. She should be careful." Despite all the whispers and stares, Thomas and Catherine found themselves drawn to each other in ways neither had experienced before. That first afternoon, Catherine's mother Mary invited Thomas to stay for dinner, partly out of curiosity and partly because she could see something different in her daughter's eyes. During the meal, Thomas told them about his life in the mountains, his work as a carpenter, and his Cherokee heritage. He spoke honestly about the loneliness he had felt and how he had heard about Catherine through travelers' stories. Catherine, in turn, shared her love of books, her work teaching children, and her dreams of having a family someday. What surprised everyone, including Catherine herself, was how easy it was to talk to Thomas. He listened to every word she said as if it was the most important thing he had ever heard. He asked thoughtful questions about her interests and shared stories that made her laugh. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt like someone was truly seeing her as a person, not just as the too tall woman. As the days passed, Thomas extended his stay in Millbrook. He found work helping to repair the church roof, a job that no one else in town was tall enough to handle properly. The townspeople watched in amazement as he worked, moving heavy beams by himself and reaching places that would have required multiple ladders for anyone else. Every evening, Thomas would call on Catherine with her parents' permission. They would sit on the front porch, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas would tell her Cherokee legends about the mountains and stars, while Catherine would read him poetry from her favorite books. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, both of them marveling at the fact that they had found someone who understood what it felt like to be different. The town's reaction was harsh and immediate. Children would follow them at a distance when they walked together, pointing and giggling. Adults would make loud comments about the freak show whenever Thomas and Catherine appeared in public. The local preacher even gave a sermon about unnatural unions that everyone knew was directed at them. But the cruelest comments came from people Catherine had known her whole life. Women who had pretended to pity her now spoke with open jealousy and disgust. She thinks she's too good for normal men, they would say. She's found herself a savage to match her freakish height. Thomas faced his own share of prejudice. The men in town made it clear that they didn't trust him, questioning his intentions and making comments about his kind. Some even suggested that he might be dangerous, despite the fact that he had never shown anything but gentleness and respect. One particularly difficult evening, a group of young men from town decided to confront Thomas directly. They found him walking back to the boarding house where he was staying and surrounded him with hostile faces and aggressive postures. "We don't want your kind here," one of them said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Find yourself another town and another woman to bother." Thomas could have easily handled all of them at once if he had wanted to fight. Instead, he stood calmly and spoke in his quiet voice. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I care about Catherine, and I believe she cares about me too. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but I won't let your fear stop me from trying to find happiness." The confrontation might have turned violent, but William Rose appeared with his blacksmith's hammer in hand. "This man is my guest," William announced firmly. "Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The young men backed down, but the message was clear. Thomas and Catherine were not welcome as a couple in Millbrook. The pressure from the community was intense, and both of them felt it every day. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Catherine finally voiced her fears. "Thomas, maybe everyone is right. Maybe we're too different, too strange. Maybe we're fooling ourselves into thinking this could work." Thomas took her large hand in his even larger one and looked into her eyes. "Catherine, I've been alone my whole life because I let other people's opinions make me believe I wasn't worthy of love. But when I look at you, I see the woman I've been searching for without even knowing it. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you, no matter what anyone else thinks." Catherine felt tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her exactly as she was, and she was ready to choose him back. When Thomas Walking Bear asked Catherine Rose to marry him on a spring morning in 1918, he didn't just offer her a ring. He offered her something that would silence every critic and doubter in Millbrook forever. As he knelt down on one knee in her father's garden, making himself almost eye level with her for the first time, he spoke words that would become legend in their small town. "Catherine," he said, his deep voice trembling with emotion, "I know the world sees us as different, as strange, but I want to build you a house with my own hands, a home that shows everyone how much I love you. It will be a house worthy of the queen you are, built to fit us perfectly, where we never have to make ourselves smaller for anyone else." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at this gentle giant who had traveled so far to find her. In that moment, she realized that Thomas wasn't just offering her marriage. He was offering her a life where she could finally stand tall and proud. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Rose family home. Only Catherine's immediate family attended, along with the preacher who had agreed to perform the ceremony after much persuasion and a generous donation from William Rose. The townspeople had made their feelings clear. They wanted no part in what they called a spectacle. But Catherine had never felt more beautiful. Her mother had sewn her a dress that actually fit her tall frame properly. And for once, she didn't have to worry about looking too big or too imposing. Standing next to Thomas, she felt perfectly proportioned, perfectly matched, perfectly loved. After the ceremony, Thomas immediately began working on his promise. He had already scouted the perfect location during his courtship, a beautiful piece of land on the outskirts of town where ancient oak trees provided shade and a small creek ran clear and cold. William Rose had helped him purchase the land. Impressed by Thomas's dedication and the obvious love between his daughter and her new husband, Thomas's first task was to gather materials, and he approached this like everything else in his life, with careful planning and incredible dedication. He walked deep into the mountains, selecting trees that had been growing for decades. He didn't just cut down any tree he found. Instead, he chose each one carefully, looking for the straightest grain, strongest wood, the most beautiful patterns. The townspeople watched in amazement as Thomas single-handedly felled trees that would have challenged teams of men. He would study each tree for long minutes, running his massive hands along the bark before making his cut with perfect precision. Then he would carry the entire trunk on his shoulders, walking miles back to the building site without stopping. To rest for the foundation, Thomas quarried his own stone from the mountains. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with wagon loads of perfectly shaped rocks that fit together like puzzle pieces. Catherine would often ride out to the building site to bring him lunch. She would find him working alone, his shirt soaked with sweat, carefully placing each stone exactly where it needed to be. "Why don't you hire some help?" Catherine asked. One afternoon, as she watched him struggle with a particularly large cornerstone, Thomas paused in his work and looked at her with a smile. "I guess this house is my promise to you. Every stone I place, every beam I raise, every nail I drive, it's all my way of showing you how much you mean to me. This house will be built with my hands and my love, nothing else." The design Thomas had in mind was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. He planned 12-foot ceilings throughout the house, high enough that both he and Catherine could walk comfortably without ducking. The doorways would be 8 feet tall. The windows positioned so Catherine could tend the garden she had always dreamed of without having to stoop. Every detail was planned with their unique needs in mind. As the walls began to rise, people started coming from neighboring towns just to see what the Indian giant was building. They expected something crude and simple, but what they found was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Every joint was perfect, every angle was true, every surface was smooth as silk. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, 7 days a week. His hands became cracked and bleeding, but he never complained. When winter came and the weather turned harsh, he built a shelter over his work area and continued building by lamplight. Catherine would worry about him working so hard, but Thomas seemed driven by a purpose that went beyond simple construction. "I'm not just building us a house," he explained to Catherine one evening as they sat by the fire in their temporary cabin. "I'm building proof that love can create something beautiful, something that will last long after we're gone." It's the most remarkable feature of the house was the woodwork. Thomas carved Cherokee symbols into every doorframe, symbols of protection, prosperity, and eternal love. He crafted built-in furniture that was perfectly proportioned for their height. The kitchen counters were higher than normal, the beds were longer and stronger, and the chairs were designed to comfortably accommodate people of their size. As the house neared completion, something unexpected began to happen. The same people who had mocked Thomas and Catherine started to show up asking for help with their own building projects. They had seen the quality of Thomas's work and realized that his size and strength made him uniquely qualified for certain jobs. The first to approach him was ironically old Peterson, who had been one of the harshest critics of the marriage. His barn had been damaged in a storm, and he needed someone tall and strong enough to repair the roof. Swallowing his pride, he asked Thomas for help. Thomas could have refused, could have reminded Peterson of all the cruel things he had said. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning to take a look." Word spread quickly about Thomas's skill and fair prices. Soon he had more work than he could handle. The same people who had called him a savage were now calling him the best carpenter in 3 counties.
Ow.
But Thomas never let their change of heart go to his head. He continued to work with the same dedication and integrity that had built his reputation. The house took 18 months to complete, and when it was finished, it was truly something to behold. 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch, it looked like a castle compared to the other homes in the area. The craftsmanship was so fine that people would run their hands along the walls, just to feel the smoothness of the wood. But the most beautiful part of the house wasn't the perfect joinery or the intricate carvings. It was the love that had gone into every detail. Thomas had created a space where he and Catherine could live without compromise, where their height was an advantage rather than a problem, where they could be completely themselves. On the day they moved in, Catherine stood in the main room with tears streaming down her face. The ceiling soared above them, the windows let in perfect light. Everything was exactly the right size for their bodies and their dreams. "It's perfect," she whispered to Thomas, who was watching her reaction. With nervous anticipation, "No," Thomas replied, putting his arms around his wife. "Now it's perfect, because you're in it." The house became the talk of the region. Visitors came from hundreds of miles away to see the house that love built, as people had started calling it. Some came out of curiosity, others came to see if the stories about the giant carpenter were true. But everyone who saw the house left with a different understanding of what love could accomplish. Thomas and Catherine had proven that being different wasn't a curse, it was a gift that allowed them to create something truly extraordinary together. The years that followed Thomas and Catherine's wedding became the most remarkable chapter in Millbrook's history. Their house, standing proudly on the hill overlooking the town, became more than just a home. It became a symbol of what was possible. When love conquered fear and prejudice, within a year of moving into their custom-built house, Catherine discovered she was expecting their first child. The town buzzed with speculation and whispered concerns about what kind of baby such tall people might have. But when little Anna Rose was born in the spring of 1920, she was perfectly healthy and, while longer than most babies, completely normal in every way that mattered. Catherine proved to be a natural mother, and Thomas was surprisingly gentle with his tiny daughter. Neighbors who had once questioned their union now watched in amazement as the giant man would cradle his baby with hands that could split logs. Singing Cherokee lullabies in his deep, soft voice, Anna Rose grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to have a father who could lift her to pick apples from the highest branches, and a mother who never needed a ladder to reach anything. 3 more children followed over the next 6 years. Margaret came in 1922, followed by Samuel in 1924, and finally little Ruth in 1926. All 4 children inherited their parents' height to varying degrees. But more importantly, they inherited their parents' kindness, intelligence, and resilience. The Rose-Walking Bear children, as they were known in town, became some of the most well-mannered and capable young people anyone had ever seen. The transformation in how the community treated Thomas and Catherine was gradual but undeniable. It started with practical necessity. When the church steeple was damaged in a storm, who else but Thomas could repair it? When the school needed new desks built, who else had the skill and precision to make them exactly right? When Mrs. Henderson's roof started leaking, who else could fix it properly? Thomas never charged unfair prices or held grudges against those who had treated him poorly. He simply did excellent work for fair payment and let his actions speak louder than any words could. His reputation as a master builder spread far beyond Millbrook, and soon people were traveling from other states to hire the Cherokee giant for their most challenging construction projects. Catherine, meanwhile, had quietly become the town's unofficial teacher for children who struggled in regular school. Parents who had once whispered cruel things about her height now brought their children to her for help with reading and arithmetic. She had a gift for making difficult concepts simple and for seeing potential in children that others had given up on. The Rose-Walking Bear house became a gathering place for people who didn't quite fit in elsewhere. Traveling musicians would stop by to share songs with Thomas, who had learned to play several instruments despite his oversized hands. Struggling families would find anonymous gifts of food and firewood on their doorsteps, gifts that everyone suspected came from the generous couple on the hill. One of the most touching transformations involved old Peterson, who had been among the harshest critics of their marriage. His grandson Billy was born with a club foot that made walking difficult and left him isolated from other children. When Billy was 8 years old, Peterson swallowed his pride and asked Catherine if she might tutor the boy who was falling behind. In school, due to his frequent absences, Catherine not only agreed to teach Billy, but also asked Thomas to build the child a special shoe that would help him walk more easily. Thomas spent weeks crafting a custom orthotic device, and Catherine spent hours each day helping Billy with his lessons. Within a year, Billy was not only keeping up with his classmates, but excelling beyond them. Peterson, who had once called Thomas a savage, now openly declared him to be the finest man in the county. "I was wrong about you both," he told Thomas. "One day, while paying for carpentry work, I let my fear make me blind to your character. My grandson is walking and learning because of your kindness, and I'll never forget that." As the children grew older, they faced their own challenges related to their height and mixed heritage. But they had something their parents never had: a strong foundation of love and acceptance at home. Thomas taught them Cherokee traditions and stories, while Catherine ensured they received excellent educations. The children learned to be proud of who they were, rather than ashamed of being different. Samuel, who grew to be nearly as tall as his father, became fascinated with engineering and went on to design bridges and buildings across the South. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, specializing in helping children with learning difficulties. Anna Rose studied medicine and became one of the first female doctors in Tennessee. Little Ruth, who inherited her father's artistic abilities, became a renowned sculptor. His work was displayed in galleries across the country. The house itself continued to attract visitors from far and wide. People came to see the architectural marvel that Thomas had built. They stayed to hear the story of how love had transformed to outcasts into pillars of their community. Travel writers began including the house that love built in their guidebooks, and the house became a popular stop for people traveling through Tennessee. Thomas and Catherine aged gracefully in their mountain home, surrounded by children, grandchildren, in a community that had learned to see past surface differences to the character beneath. Thomas continued working as a carpenter well into his 70s, though he began taking on apprentices to help with the more physically demanding jobs. Catherine never stopped teaching, and her kitchen table remained a place where struggling students could find patient help and encouragement. The couple's love story became local legend, told and retold with growing admiration rather than mockery. Young people facing their own challenges with being different would often be reminded of Thomas and Catherine's example. If those two could find happiness despite everything, parents would tell their children, then there's hope for everyone. In 1981, Catherine Rose, walking bare, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89. Bedroom where Thomas had carried her as a bride 63 years earlier, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had inherited her strength and his gentleness. Thomas, who had rarely spent a day apart from his beloved wife, seemed lost without her. True to the deep bond they had shared, Thomas followed Catherine just 6 months later. He was found sitting in his favorite chair on the front porch, looking out over the valley where he had spent his life building not just houses, but a legacy of love and acceptance. In his lap was a letter he had been writing to his grandchildren, reminding them to always choose kindness over judgment and love over fear. The house stands today as a historical landmark, with a bronze plaque by the front door that reads, "Built by love, sustained by acceptance," a testament to the power of seeing beauty where others see only difference. Tours are given daily. Visitors often comment that they can still feel the love that went into every hand-carved detail. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Thomas Walking Bear and Catherine Rose isn't the house itself, but the lesson there. Lives taught. They proved that being different isn't a curse to be hidden, but a gift to be celebrated. They showed that love sees past the surface to the heart beneath, and they demonstrated that to people who refuse to let the world make them smaller can build something truly extraordinary together. Their story continues to inspire people who feel too different, too tall, too anything to fit into the world's narrow definitions of normal. Thomas and Catherine's love reminds us all that somewhere out there is someone who will see us exactly as we are and love us not despite our differences, but because of them.